It's my joy to welcome you all to this exciting webinar today. Our speaker is Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson. He is Vice President of American Jewish University and the Abner and Rosalind Goldstein Dean's Chair. He's also a professor of philosophy there as well. Really, Rabbi Brad comes to us with a lot of great credentials. His scholarly fields are Jewish philosophy and theology. He emphasizes a process approach to integrating contemporary scientific insights from cosmology, quantum physics, evolutionary theory, and neuroscience into a dynamic view of God, Torah, and ethics. He's a charter member of the Society for the Study of Judaism and Science. He's authored 11 books, most recently Renewing the Process of Creation, A Jewish Integration of Science and Spirit, and also God of Becoming and Relationship, The Dynamic Nature of Process Theology. Both have been published by Jewish Lights. He also has launched a really kind of exciting series called Walking With, where he produced Walking with God. It's available as, on the web as complimentary PDF files. Walking with Justice, Walking with Life, Walking with the Jewish Calendar, and those are really highly recommended. Rabbi Artson, let me introduce you, and please, why don't you get started?
Thank you very much, Professor. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. You know, in an age in which I think both religion and science are facing challenges, to try to seek places of integrity and commonality is a great value. And so I want to spend some time laying out my thoughts on that, and then I'm eager for us to enter into conversation together. To try to set the frame and break open some possibilities for us, I want to remind everybody of one of the founding thinkers in this field, Professor Ian Barber, no longer with us, who would speak often about four possible relationships between religion and science. The first, he said, was one of conflict. So there are people on both sides of the divide who think that either one can accept a religious frame of reference or one can accept a scientific frame of reference, but they are mutually incompatible. Those people confuse a particular kind of religion and a particular kind of science with the whole enterprise. But what they share on both sides is a certain kind of literalism and the assumption that truth only comes in one form. There's only one way to know it correctly. So on the religion side of the divide are people who believe that they have literal and verbal revelation. They have an inside track on the will of the divine, and so they don't need science. They don't, frankly, need other religions either, but because their religion embodies all there is to know about the truth. And there's people on the science side who have a similar idea that science isn't just a tool for a particular set of information, but it is indeed the only way to know everything about everything. And therefore, if something isn't scientifically verified, it's fake. It's make-believe. If that's your metaphysics of science, and there's a lot of scientists who do hold to that metaphysics, and if that's your metaphysics of religion, then indeed there's going to be an impossible conflict between the two. Either you believe in evolution or you believe in the Bible. But those are not the only ways that this kind of thing happened. And what I want to do is highlight for you alternatives and alternative approaches. So let's look at the second of his four possibilities. The second relationship category he comes up with is independence. Independence is religion has its area in which it is sovereign, and science has the area in which it's sovereign, and they don't overlap. The shorthand for this is often that science asks how questions, and religion asks why questions. So questions of meaning, questions of significance, questions of value, well, that's in the religion realm, and religion gets to have opinions about that uncontested by scientists. And then science gets to tell us how things work, and that is an area where science is supreme and no one else should weigh in. For many people, that's a very helpful approach. It does carve out independence. It does allow for a legitimacy of both enterprises. The challenge is, for some of us, the world doesn't work that way. That scientists weigh in all the time, not only with what's true factually, but what are values. If people, for example, have an impact on climate change as a species, don't we then have an obligation to do something about climate change? It's hard to separate the is and the ought, the fact and the value, in a hermetically sealed, separate container that never sloshes into the other. And that's true on the religion side as well. Religious people are all the time having opinions. Was Moses an actual historical figure? Was Jesus? Was Buddha? Is there a way in which the universe leans towards increasing justice, or does it not? What is the nature of the truth of Scripture, whatever your Scripture happens to be? These are questions in which religion often crosses over into assertions of information, of fact, of true or false. So some people hold on to this because it preserves the integrity of each, but I think at too great a cost for me. Moving more towards where I'm comfortable, although I'm going to push us a little further than that, is the idea of dialogue. That is, science is one set of phenomena. Religion is another set of historical experiences. And while they are distinctive, they can actually be in conversation because they have many things that they share. So people who favor dialogue tend to emphasize that both religion and science are expressions of curiosity, of wonder, of marvel. You get a scientist in a lab or a religious person with a bunch of scripture, and they're like giddy children in a toy store, discovering all kinds of things about the world they live in and what makes it tick. And that means they have what to talk to each other about. On two levels. One is to be able to police each other. No, no, you crossed the line. You can't say that. Or no, no, that's not actually factually correct. Let me tell you the way that actually works. So part of it is to police the other, and part of it is to enhance the other. Oh yeah, you think that's true in your storytelling? Let me tell you a story from evolution that might fit into that framework. And then there are some of us who temperamentally need more than that. Some of us who believe we live in a universe, that is to say, one world, so that there may in fact be multiple vehicles for approaching the world we live in and understanding it better, but ultimately something cannot be permanently religiously true and scientifically false, or scientifically true and religiously false. That these are different approaches towards something greater than either enterprise. And that's where I'd like us to park for a moment. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with me at any point in this conversation. But to be able to think about it together, I want to assume there is one world, and that world is real. That's the world we find ourselves in. It's the world we are a manifestation of, too. And to understand both ourselves and the non-human parts of nature, we're going to apply multiple tools to be able to do that. So here's something I need to say to those of us who are fundamentalists, either on the religion side or on the science side. I do not believe that religion can account for all reality on the level of capital T truth, and I don't believe that science does either. So let me offer you a thumbnail definition of science. I think the most useful definition of science is that science is the best technique possible for exploring those phenomena that are public, testable, and replicable. Public meaning it doesn't happen in the privacy of your own core. It's something others have access to. Testable. Can I come up with a way of determining whether that is something that I can accurately describe? Is there a way to test what caused it or what didn't cause it? Is there a way to separate out cause from order of unfolding? Right? These kinds of questions make it testable. And that's a key part of knowing whether what we're discussing is science. And then the third one is it replicable. If something is public and testable, but it only happens once, it's never going to happen again, then I can't really test it. I can't compare and contrast it. That means that science isn't, in fact, the way of knowing reality. It's a way of knowing a set within reality. Those things that are public, replicable, testable, are amenable to scientific inquiry. And more is, in fact, fitting into that category as the years and the century progresses. Things that used to be philosophy become science. So psychology used to not have a clear agenda for how to investigate. That is now not in the Department of Philosophy anymore. In most places, it's in its own department and thinks of itself as a science. But once you admit that science is the world's best tool for determining that set of events, the events that are public, replicable, and testable, then you're kind of admitting that there are things that aren't. There are things that are real, but they're not public, replicable, and testable. Private moods, private insights, private memories. There are lots of things that happen in the universe that aren't discernible in a public way. Science can't weigh in on those. Scientists can. And here I want to highlight for you that scientists, just like religious people, are people. So many religious people have opinions that are not, in fact, authorized by their religion, and they're allowed to do that. They just can't claim that it's their religion that teaches it. And there are many scientists who have very strong convictions. But if it's not public, replicable, testable, it's not evidence-based, then it's their opinion as a person. It's not science weighing in. So look, the claim that something has to be public and testable and replicable is itself a claim. A scientist could say that's not true. Science, if it's not in that category, it doesn't exist. It's not real. Okay, that's a legitimate opinion to have. I think it leads to an impoverished life, but you could think that. But you can't tell me that science verifies that, because the technique itself is limited to that subset of stuff. But if that's true, then what are those other things? What are the things that are not factually verifiable, that don't repeat in a way that can be submitted to a test to analyze its component parts or its causality or its link in the chain of events? What are those things? In my book, I talk about the 5 M's. I talk about 5 ways of prehending the world that are not limited to those things. And those 5 M's are math, meditation, metaphor, music, and myth. Those are 5. I picked them because of the M's. They're all bigger than an M. So math speaks for itself. Math is nature's language. But have you ever thought about how weird it is that when we want to describe the motion of the planets or the interaction of physical components out in the world, we use a symbol system that was devised by a primate brain? It's uncanny that nature speaks mathematics, and mathematics is a human invention. So math does track stuff in the world beyond us, and it is a powerful symbol system. Meditation is my M word for all spiritual exercises: meditation, prayer, yoga, dance. For some of you, hiking in the wilds can be a spiritual endeavor. We're now having the festival of Hanukkah. There'll be a slew of other holidays. Our Christian friends will be celebrating Christmas. These are all ways of relating to the world and gaining insight about what it means to be alive, what it means to be human, what it means to have a heart that embraces the world beyond our bodies. So that's a way of knowing too. Metaphor. We often use metaphor to speak about things that are not tangible, factual, verifiable, or falsifiable. So the fact that we speak in metaphors about time, for example, that the future is always in that direction and the past is always back there, that seems to me to be a biologically mediated metaphor because we move in that direction. So that looks like the future to us. Um, but poetry contains enormous wisdom. It's just not the kind of thing you can test or you can come up with an exam for. Music conveys deep, deep moments of insight and breakthrough and connection without being factual or verifiable. And finally, myth, religious stories and narrative of all kinds convey great, great insights that help us live better lives attuned to each other and to the world without being the kind of things that are facts that you can prove or disprove. So if we say that's a useful way to move in the world, and we say that science is by far humanity's best ever tool. Look, we're talking with each other right now in real time because of science. So I'm a big enthusiast. I love science. But I'm also aware that there's a lot left out, that what's left out is relationship and meaning and connection and justice and kindness and gratitude, the things that make our lives fully worth living, the things that allow us to move beyond our anxiety and our tensions and our depressions. These are things that science can weigh in on helpfully, but cannot determine. And for me, that's the realm of religion. I had a teacher who said, I think significantly, that the Declaration of Independence, when it talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that life and liberty get defined by legal systems, but the pursuit of happiness, the founding figures in American history did not define. They left it to our own private religiosity, our own shared spirituality, to come up with what makes for human thriving, what makes for human happiness. On the religion side, I am a process theologian. And for those of you who are not familiar, process theology, it has many, many people who have been participating in it. Alfred North Whitehead was a great philosopher in the 30s and 40s at Harvard who wrote some of the founding works of process thought. There are a group of people alive today, men and women, John Cobb, and others who have produced this work. Its core insight, trying to move the metaphysics, which is to say what makes the natural world tick, is a combination of the claim that everything is in the process of becoming. Actual things are always in the process of becoming. That is to say, everything that is a process in motion. And every becoming process is connected to every other process. I, at this moment, am about to become the latest version of me. And I do that by taking into account everything that's happened in the world that touches me up to this moment. And then I respond to that by making a decision of some kind. And that decision, that new me, then becomes data for the rest of the world in turn to continue to unfold. You're listening to my speaking. And as you listen, you're saying, well, that makes sense. No, that's not really right. And each time you do that, you become a different person, slightly different. You're still much the same you were. But let me highlight for you that in deciding how you feel about something I'm saying, you then become the person who has decided about what I just said. You have integrated what I've said into your person, either accepting it, rejecting it, modifying it. And at that point, you're becoming that person. When you get to make a comment, that will become the data for the rest of us to integrate, respond to, and change. And our journey, once we take it, is forever. The past is singular and eternal. But the future is open-ended and multiple, meaning any one of us at any moment are free to make different decisions. And part of the power of a process metaphysic is like science, it holds open the real capacity to make choices that have an impact on the system as a whole and on what future is going to become real. I could, if I get tired of this, push a button and leave. So could you. That would change the future. And once it's done, it can't be undone. So in process thought, this open-ended pluralistic future is one in which all of creation has a say in what becomes, in what unfolds. And unlike much of Western thought, which prioritizes discrete, objective ideas as really real, that starts with Plato, but it goes through Kant and influences much of contemporary thought as well. Process thinkers say that what's really real are becoming events. And then sometimes we lift back from them to think about them and to reflect on them. But the reflection is useful to the degree that it allows us to dive deep back in to actual becoming. But it is not itself real. Ideas are useful, but not themselves objectively existent. Only interacting becomings, you, me, animals, plants, elements, planets, all of those things are actually real. And the tools to understand them are useful. And so we do this dance between reality as it is, stepping back to reflect on it, to systematize it, and then taking those ideas as tools to jump back in and say, do I now understand it better because of those ideas? Which then get modified, and we jump back to think some more, back and forth, back and forth. But reality are the actual becomings, the things that really exist. And so in that case, I also want to say there's no such thing as religion. Religion isn't an object out there. It's not, it's a cluster of ways of becoming, and we cling to them and we give them names. So we talk about Christianity as though it's a thing. We talk about Judaism as though it's a thing. But it's not. It's a set of people. It's a set of experiences. It's a set of visions of the future. It's a body of literature. None of the people with religious labels, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Jewish, whatever, can agree to all of the texts that are their holy texts. They agree on a lot. But then when you get to the more modern period, this person's in and that person's out. And that depends on what denomination you're in, what group you're in, your own temperament. So I want to highlight religion isn't a thing. Religion is a mode of human behaving and belonging that we give a label to. We see it as common, but that's true of science as well. There's not a thing called biology and a thing called physics. These are tools and communities exploring aspects of reality, but it's reality that's real. So that gives us the grounds to be in with each other and to say there are aspects of reality that are best understood, best clarified by doing those activities we call biology. And there are aspects of becoming that can be best related to and clarified by doing that thing we call spirituality. In my case, Judaism. So let me say a word now specifically as a rabbi who thinks about these things. I do have to say it's weird to just keep talking to myself this way, however enchanting I find myself. But let me say something in the Jewish world. One of the things that for me is so beautiful about Judaism is that it fits this process paradigm so well. If the universe is shaping itself and becoming, it is magnifying itself in terms of love, justice, relationship, and experience. These, I think, are the four components of what Whitehead called the lure, that optimal next choice that the divine gives us an intuitive sense of and empowers us to choose if we want. If that's what the lure is, love, justice, relationship, experience, and if we all have an intuitive sense of that, then that intuitive sense is different for each of us. Because the lure that I have is what's the optimal next step for me in my life at this moment. But that may not be, probably isn't, what's optimal in your life at this moment. That means the divine isn't up there, out there. The divine permeates all becoming, empowers all becoming, and is personally experienced in the real, not in the Platonic ideal. So God isn't the ultimately true idea separate from the world. God is the word we use for the mindfulness that bubbles up through reality, manifesting in you and me and everything around us. And science is a crucial tool to know that something better. Science guides us to what's possible in a physical universe. Science has been amazing in unleashing for us the ways nature is way more marvelous than we ever gave it credit for. There are miraculous things happening all the time. During COVID, my wife and I started raising monarch butterflies in our yard. And watching these caterpillars grow to 2,000 times their original size, and then spin some silk to hang from a rooftop or a leaf or something, and dissolve into a cocoon of beautiful translucent green with gold dots around the rim, and then watch that transparent cocoon become brown and gold and orange. And then at some point, a butterfly breaks out who already knows how to be a butterfly. Everything that that butterfly needed was in the caterpillar goop that dissolved and became the cocoon. It's astonishing. If you didn't see it, you would call it science fiction. You would call it fantasy. And the world is full of such marvels. And what science trains me to do is to attend, to pay attention, to see it. But where science leaves me then is I feel the need to say thank you. And I feel the need to say, okay, if all life is related, then what do I owe my brothers and sisters, living things? What's my gift back to them and to the universe that I didn't create, I was born into? But I was born in with a prehensile thumb. I was born in with a human mind. I was born into it with the harvest of millions of years of evolution so that I have what I need to make my way in the world in wonder and in joy. To me, the two are partners. Science heightens and enhances my delight. Science gives me deep information about how the world is way more extraordinary than my eyes could perceive on their own. And knowing that adds to my spiritual life. But what religion gives me is a way to say thank you and a way to walk in the world with gratitude and with humility, and to know that the story is ultimately not my story alone, but mine only to the extent that I'm part of something bigger. Last point I want to make before I open it up to you. This process idea of the divine also includes the idea that God is not the exception to the rules. God is the instantiation of the rules and the source of them. And the rules don't have an objective existence either. The rules are the name we give to the way matter interacts or the way beings interact. So speed of light, gravity, these are names we give to how things behave with each other. And God is the one who makes all this possible. God is both the becoming and the source of the becoming. And to the extent that there is mindfulness, it's not for process people just the frosting on the top of the universe. It bubbles all the way down. We see mindfulness all the way down. That means that an electron that moves from one energy rung to another is behaving in a way that is an expression of its own teleology, its own purpose. I'm not saying here that electrons think, oh, it's getting crowded here, I'm going to move, but it isn't simply an add-on later. There's no such thing as dead matter, and then mindfulness gets globbed onto the top like a cherry on a sundae. We see the universe bubbling up in expansive mindfulness that evolves continuously from baseline matter to the beginnings of life, which adds to it the layer of self-replication, and the idea that one's interiority has to be preserved against one's exterior. And there's a difference between the two. That homeostasis becomes an additional manifestation of a heightened mindfulness, which then moves into motility, the ability to move toward the light, towards nutrients, away from the shadow, away from a predator. That again heightens mindfulness. And as we climb this ladder of mindfulness, at some point with animals, it becomes an aware mindfulness, the ability to see and discriminate, the ability to love, a great mammalian advance, um, the ability to care for one's young, the ability to prefer or to avoid. And then in people, it becomes a self-consciousness, the awareness of awareness. But there's nothing where it just suddenly started. So let me tell you, when I was a teenager, and I had a lot of pets. I had dogs and cats and horses and an octopus named Ichabod Clancy. And I was very interested in biology at the time. I thought of it as a career. Um, and I remember reading in the late 70s, every biology textbook I could get my hand on said that animals don't actually emote, that when we attribute to them human feelings, love, fear, anger, gratitude, whatever, that we're imposing a human sensibility on an animal. And I always thought those biologists needed to live with a pet for a while. Anyone who has lived with a cat or a dog or a horse or an octopus knows that they have lots of sentiment and that their sentiment is in fact a lot like ours. My octopus, Ichabod Clancy, when I would come down into the garage where his aquarium was, would recognize me and become a bumpy brown, which is octopus for happy. If I put a crab in for him to eat it, he would start flashing all kinds of electric colors, and that was octopus excited. If I was with some other person he didn't recognize, he would get white and pale with black rings around his eyes. That's octopus scared. And if someone tapped the glass and he would get offended at that, he would get red and bumpy, and that was octopus rage. Look, even his colors are our colors. Um, and it's easy to discern. You know when your dog is embarrassed or when your dog is happy or when your dog is glad to see you, that your dog loves you when you come home. Like these are real things. And it turns out then that just as human emotion is a continuum from living things that never had a beginning in the evolution of this cosmos, it just was built in and it was an emergent phenomenon. So too, mindfulness is an emergent phenomenon. And for all we know, we're midway on the stream. Maybe there'll be species beyond us whose mindfulness exceeds ours in ways we can't conceive of. But it's not something that just started with us. It's something that started long before us and that we are the inheritors of at our level. Religion and science together reinforce that for me. They give me that sense that I'm part of a family that's way bigger than people, way bigger than primates, way bigger than mammals, way bigger even than just living things, that I and the universe are one, and that we are different manifestations of a oneness out of which we spring. Feels to me that that kind of religiosity and a science that's a little more humble, so that it recognizes that it is indeed the preeminent tool for a particular kind of exploration, but not for all knowing, actually makes for a better world in which people can be the fullest version of themselves, in which our spirits and our minds feed each other, in which our hearts are filled with the emotional harvest of what both science well done and religion well done can bring to us. So I'm going to leave us with that. I think I've talked for a fair amount of time, and I'm going to open it up for the Reverend to respond and then for whatever questions you may want to bring.
Great. Thank you so much, Rabbi Brad. That was really fabulous. Let's now invite in the Reverend Richard McCulloch. Richard is an ordained pastor in the United Methodist Church. He's now retired. He served in both college students ministry and in the local church for 43 years. 10 of those years was as university chaplain and director of the Abraham K. Spiritual Life Center at the American University in Washington, D.C. There, he continually coordinated an interfaith staff of faith leaders. The central focus of his ministry has been pastoral care and social justice. He has continued his interest in interfaith issues and social justice in retirement. Richard, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Well, I'm not a scholar. I literally could be referred to more as a pastor. But I was really struck that your delineation of science and religion in many ways has found its mark on my own personal journey in some very meaningful ways. And I really appreciated your presentation and how you delineated the importance of the journey. I was struck in terms of my own journey about how as a young person who this will mark my age, who grew up around my college age in the civil rights movement and then in the anti-war movement. And I was studying theology at the seminary during the actual times when the world was in a similar turmoil of what might be described as the world today. I can still remember being in a classroom where we were studying philosophy and how some philosophers would take the concept of good and flip it on its head and make evil the good. And while we were in a break on that discussion, the news came in that Martin Luther King had just been shot. That has had in terms of experience at the level of trying to make the world make sense, had an incredibly profound impact on my life. I turned to scriptural study and I saw what my church, my Christian tradition was doing with scripture. And I just saw, there's a disconnect between what has been defined as true, as you expressed it, and how I experience the world. And I was led to understand that scripture is not what a lot of people say it is, that it really is a kind of a human attempt to lend honest expression and honest understanding of what was happening in their life in a way that brought meaning and purpose and new life to something that in some ways was very trying and very difficult. And so the transition from literalism to understanding scripture as a journey, an expression of this is what the journey is for me, and how that took place in a community, jointly trying to survive and understand each other and find new direction. Those are points where what you were sharing really made sense to me. to try to hear each other, to try to break the boundaries of what they had been taught and think in new ways and think of new ideas about how we can claim new life and new direction and move forward. And that became a change process. I came to understand that what happened in the biblical era was a fear of that process, wanting to control it, and lending maybe artificial truth, locking it down rather than allowing it to proceed as human beings in dialogue with one another, trying to make sense of their world. So in those themes and those ideas that you expressed, those were the things that made sense to me. And it really prepared me, I think, in some sense, for my role when I became a university chaplain and the director of a center where there was a rabbi and priests and representatives of the various aspects of the Muslim community at that time. And the only thing that we could rely upon in order to make an impact upon the campus was to really learn how to hear one another, to listen to one another, to appreciate the pain and the frustration. When I was there for a time, the pain and frustration of the difference between the Sunni and the Shia community, who were in massive disagreement with one another, and how that impacted the Jewish community, who wanted to both celebrate in the same building on a Friday night and had a difficult time. Those kind of things lent the importance of truth, a way forward, meaning in life can only happen as we have the courage and the ability to listen and care for one another. And it is only in that we can, well, find a way forward in terms of goodness, mercy, and justice. A lot of my ministry ended up being in those areas, civil rights, women's rights, those kinds of things. I helped establish a group in DC called the Church's Conference for Shelter and Housing, and it was all the different ways in which people were trying to find a way to bring healing in the life of people who didn't have a place to live, and conversation with one another, what each of you were doing, how that overlap with what I'm doing, what can we learn from each other, what's the way forward, how can we do things better. So those are the kind of ways in which your presentation spoke to my life. And I identify with so much of what you were saying, and in a number of different ways. My growing up was in West Virginia, and with dogs and cattle and chickens, and I had my favorite people I used to talk to. Various chickens I could better relate to than others. And but there is an aspect of that where it grows into a sense of awareness for all of creation. And I'll end with one thing about that, and that is there was a new concept that came up in the world here in the last decade or so about mindfulness. And I always thought, what is this now? A new idea. And the person who has taught me the most about mindfulness is my daughter-in-law. My son married a young woman from northern India, and she's from a different religious tradition, but she has a pattern of wholeness and a sense of oneness about all creation and a sense of mindfulness about food and relationships and how she relates to the world. That has been a teacher for me, just to see how she functions. And I say to myself, oh, okay, now I think I understand more about what mindfulness is all about. I think I'll just stop now. I've said a number of things, as I say, not scholarly, but much more on personal journey response to what you have said.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. And I want to invite the audience to feel free to enter some questions. We already have a question in. I don't know if you two, Brad, do you have any comments back to Richard, or just agreement?
No, let's open it up. Sounds wonderful.
Okay, sounds good. So let me, here's the first question. This is from Robert Friedman. As a rabbi who loves process theology and who first encountered process theology through you and Rachel Adler, it is always wonderful and grounding to hear you speak on it. I'm curious how you view the lure of love, justice, relationship, and experience in relationship with the more immanent God concepts of Buber and Levinas and others.
Thank you, Rabbi. That's a great question. Look, I think the challenge is, I love Martin Buber, and I find him incredibly evocative. For those of you who are not Jewish and are familiar with Buber's concept of I and thou, I encourage you to go get his book about the Hasidic masters. He retells the stories of the Hasidim as a way of illustrating I and thou theology. And it's a beautiful, beautiful way to kind of step into classical Hasidic thinking and emoting. But Buber's not systemic. Buber doesn't tell us. What I wanted to know was, how does this universe work? How does the world work where there's so much suffering and so much evil, and yet I still see a kind of pull towards goodness built in, baked in? And Buber doesn't answer that question. He gives me a way to look at the divine, a way to see the divine. I also think, by the way, he sets up a false dichotomy. I think that God is also found in I-it, in the relationships that have some utility. You guys bring me onto this here, and you didn't bring me on because you like Brad Artson as a person. You brought me on because you want to hear certain ideas discussed. That's not I-thou, that's I-it. But if some of those ideas click, that's an avenue into a real transformation. So I think Buber exaggerated the difference between the two. And Levinas, I think, has many very fetching ideas, but he too isn't systemic. I don't know from Levinas how religion and science relate. I don't know how you determine the truth. I don't know how God reveals, or if God reveals. I don't know the status of revelation. I don't know why bad things happen. Like, there's a whole bunch of questions people ask about the world that Levinas doesn't talk about at all. All he talks about is our obligation to the other, which I agree we have one, but I'd like to know how his universe coheres. And so here I just want to admit that theologians, philosophers are an odd sort of duck. We want the world to make sense. And we believe that if we don't ask weird questions, it never will make sense. We'll just have these discrete phenomena. So in much the same way that biology spent its first couple hundred years trying to find a narrative, and the great thing that Charles Darwin did for us was give biology a narrative that could then create a research agenda and a coherent telling that they could then tweak and edit over time. I think that's what religion offers the universe, is a coherent version of telling. So those two thinkers, I think, are really valuable, but they don't ultimately do for me what Whitehead and process thought does, which is to integrate everything I knew into a coherent single story.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question from Elizabeth Bjorkman. How do you respond to someone who says, I'm not religious, I'm only interested in spirituality? That is, how do you define spirituality which doesn't relate to any religion?
Okay, I just need to tell you, I'm now going to talk as me, and I'm a fairly idiosyncratic person. So don't expect this answer from every other rabbi or even any other rabbi. This is just me. I don't at all feel the need to talk people into anything. Um, Trying to talk people into why they should be spiritual the way I am or religious the way I am feels like a profound misunderstanding of individuality. So I can tell you what something means for me or why I find it beautiful or meaningful. And if that resonates with you, great. But if it doesn't, also great. Like, let's go live your life. So I will tell you, I can be very disappointing to parents of young Jews who come home and say, why be Jewish? And so they come to the rabbi, and I'm supposed to tell the kid why the kid should be Jewish. And I end up saying, if it doesn't work for you, then don't. It's a big world. There's lots of wonderful ways to be human. So I never quite understand what someone means when they say I'm spiritual but not religious. It's kind of like I'm hungry, but I never eat a particular food. Um, I think that religion tends to have to take a certain practice. Otherwise, it becomes a way to avoid the question, right? If what you mean by spiritual is I have no disciplines, I have no ways of growing my spirit, of confronting my own shortcomings, of addressing my own mistakes, of getting better at gratitude and patience and love and resilience, then it can be a way of avoiding. But I think for a lot of people, what it means is that every existent religion I know, or the one I grew up in, is so wounded by its own judgmentalism and its own triumphalism and its own making claims that it can't possibly enforce and its own inability to admit its own mistakes and its own way of setting up institutions that seem more interested in their own survival than in the thriving of their members. If that's what it means, well, I think religion has done a lot to deserve people's disdain and distrust. It's just that if we're going to be honest, so has academia, so has medicine, so has art, so has government. Tell me the human institution that hasn't betrayed its trust again and again and again. So one thing I would put out there is nobody who says, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, would say, I'm not into government. I'm into self-government. I mean, maybe some would, but you don't want to be neighbors with those people, right? The difference is you should push for good government as opposed to bad government, and you should have good medicine and not bad medicine, and good science and not bad science. And I think we should say that about religion too. There is such a thing as bad religion and good religion. I'll give you the easy rabbi test for that. If your religion or your spirituality makes you kinder, more resilient, more loving, more generous to others and to yourself, then I don't care the content of its belief or practice. It's a good religion. And if it makes you more brittle and more judgmental and more smug and more removed, then I don't care what its content or its belief claims are. It's a bad religion. Great. If what you have is spirituality and that works for you, lean in, make it work.
Great. Next question by Royce Anderson. Could you please elaborate some more on the distinction between what is empirical and what is real? Specifically, science gives us a methodology for distinguishing between what is true and what is false in the empirical world, expressed in levels of probability. If, however, something is real but not empirical, how can we distinguish between statements that are true or false in this realm, other than the authority claims of some person or institution who claims that something is true or false?
Well, let's start. Thank you. I mean, that's a really important question, and I don't have a simple answer, but I'll try to speak English while I talk. Um, I'll tell you a wonderful story. There's a great rabbi now deceased named Harold Schulweis, and he lived nearby here in the San Fernando Valley. And his daughter was, like most kids, a scientist and a skeptic. She was about 6 at the time. And she said to her daddy at nighttime, he's sitting on her bed, Daddy, how do I know that there's a God? And he said, honey, touch my arm. And so she reached up and touched his arm. And he said, touch my shoulder. And she touched his shoulder. He said, touch my face. She touched his face. And he said, touch my love. And she said, I can't touch your love. And he said, well, how do you know I love you? And she said, I just know. And he said, right. God is like love. God is not like an arm or a shoulder or a face. So science is really good with the arms and the shoulders and the face. But there are things like love that are very real. And you know they're real because of their impact, because they motivate you to do stupid things when you walk in the room and there's that person who suddenly takes your breath away and you were coherent and calm and together 1 minute, and then you look in those eyes and you're suddenly a mess. Um, my daughter has this magical ability to get my car keys and my bank account without my knowing it. Like she looks at me, bats her eyes, and there they are. It's all in her hands, and she's walking out the room. Right? I think there's a lot of things that are very, very real, that are real in a sense of relationship, in a sense of an imperative for goodness, that are not susceptible to fact testing. And we impoverish ourselves, and frankly, our lives testify that we don't actually think that that's the limit to reality. So, look, one cute little philosophical trick people like to play. The claim that the only thing that's real is that which is testable is itself not testable, right? So if you want to think the only thing that's real is what can be tested, then the assertion that only what's real can be tested is not real. Because there's a whole lot of reality that we know by the wake that it leaves. We know by the implications. We know by what it does to us or it does to our lives or the way it makes life better. And so I'm not in any way advocating that we shouldn't go to science first for those things that are science. It's just that don't think you've exhausted reality when you've exhausted that method.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for you too, as well, Rabbi Brad. I mean, so I guess I have this perspective that right now we're living in a kind of strange world where there's a lot of science denialism going on. And so people's versions of truth are very, very different based on their own perceptions that have nothing to do with reality. And I guess I'd just like to hear your perspectives on how to deal with that, because it becomes difficult for the scientist, but it also becomes difficult, I think, for the religious person who's also trying to, base themselves in a scientific truth too.
Good. So part of it, Professor Wolochak, is that many scientists have helped discredit science. A few years ago, we were at the end of physics. Remember, we had discovered everything we could possibly know about the universe, and all we were going to be doing was kind of writing footnotes to tidy it up, and then that would be the end of all discovery. We're no longer saying that anymore. They discovered the Higgs boson. They discovered that, in fact, gravity bends matter. Like, there were a whole lot of things we went, oops, and some of the latest photographs of distant space have upended the standard model. So what if we admit that science is provisional and scientists stop declaiming ultimate truth from some podium in a white jacket as though that's the end of conversation? What if they brought that provisional humility and they said, here's what the data suggests from what we know now. And of course, there may be other data. But the way to have this conversation is not to reject the collection of data. The way to proceed in this conversation is, if you have a counterclaim, come up with a test that would let us figure it out. Come up with what would be the evidence that would refute this claim, or what's the claim that accounts for the evidence better than this claim. So some anti-science is because we've just been told stuff that it turns out to be wrong. We were told that those cloth masks that we started wearing at the beginning of COVID were going to be what saved us, and it didn't. But that gave permission to people to then go beyond, to say, fine, so then anything a scientist weighs in on how to prevent COVID is equally bogus. So part of that is scientists overclaiming, but part of that is, well, I have two more things to say. Part of it is we have been so lied to by institutions, and this goes back to Richard Nixon. This goes back, we've been told stuff. The place of a woman is the home. women are too emotional. I mean, there's a whole slew of toxic nonsense that authoritative figures have said, white people have better craniums and more capacity for rational. I mean, there's just garbage that people in positions of authority have been saying for a long, long time, which makes many of us run away from authoritative claims. And I think to some degree that skepticism is now turned back on science and is not entirely bad. I think that scientists having to justify themselves to the bar of public opinion and figure out how to say it in a way that your average thoughtful person can understand is a reasonable thing to put at the foot of a scientist and say, okay, show me. But part of it is really bad religion trying to desperately turn back the clock. And that's because change is terrifying. And we do live in a world in which people who used to be marginalized and invisible are now getting some attention finally. And their voices are now contributing finally. And we are far from having fixed that problem. But I think the solution is to reach out to these communities and bring them in. Science ought to feel like a game. It should feel really exciting and really thrilling. It's the world's best mystery to solve. So let's bring people into the joy and the passion and the thrill of what we discover. And then they might discover that those things are not corrosive to our deepest values. I'll give you another example of that. During the Cold War, biological descriptions of evolution tended to focus on competition and survival of the fittest, which indeed is part of natural selection. But amazingly, when the Cold War receded, before it came back again, biologists discovered cooperation as an evolutionary force. And they started writing different kinds of papers in referee journals because there is a human side to scientific exploration, which when we mask, I think we harm science in the eyes of the public. I think showing the humanity of scientists deciding what's to be researched and what isn't can only make science more compelling and more attractive.
Great, thank you. Maynard has his hand up. He has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Brad. This was very, very stimulating presentation, and I resonate with most of every comment that you made. As a process theologian, it's the only thing that makes sense to me. Now, it seems to me that where religion in particular has defaulted, as it were, is when the leaders in religion provide easy answers to people's questions rather than exploring with persons how they arrive at wherever they are on the journey. Richard made the important point about how crucial it is to listen to others where they are on the journey. Okay, so it seems to me that the challenge is who are you going to listen to? And when they come to church, when they come to synagogue, when they come to temple, when they're looking for answers rather than trying to formulate the question in such a way that it's helpful to them. And one of the things, one of the other aspects of process theology that is so important is that it is a way that we can be comfortable, as it were, living in a world of uncertainty.
Right.
Because the future is open. So easy answers to questions. I had a woman in my science and religion discussion group several years ago who finally dropped out because she said, I want to come, I came to this group because I want to know what to believe. Well, that's not my role. That's not properly the role of any religious leader, it seems to me, as you have pointed out. But the proper role is to work with people where they are on their journey so that they can mature in their spiritual in their spiritual faith, whatever that might be.
So Maynard, I love what you're saying, and I resonate to it. Let me just say, one of the things we say in my line of work is if you hate organized religion, you'll love Judaism. It may be a problem in churches that people are seeking definitive answers. I don't think you would find 5 people at my synagogue who that's what's bringing them into the synagogue. Our classic document is the Talmud, which is a 2-shelf collection of books recording rabbinic conversations over 500 years. Those books have 5,000 arguments contained within them, and only 50 of them are resolved. That's not because of bad editing. It's because the Talmud is a book for people who love good questions and raucous arguments and are not really interested in settling the argument. So one of the things that I've been surprised by is when I talk with my Christian process friends, they're on the defensive. They're being told they're not Trinitarian, they're not Christian enough, whatever, they're not mainstream. My denomination published my 2 books on process theology. I tell this to Jews and they say, yeah, right, that makes sense. Okay, I've always thought that. I didn't know I could phrase it that way, but that makes sense. So I think part of the challenge I want to hold to all of us in a multicultural sense is don't assume that religion is anything other than a bucket that we pour things in that are not actually the same. Right? Judaism isn't just the Jewish version of Christianity, which is not just the the Christian version of Buddhism. Like these are actually distinctive phenomena that we lump together in the West, but they're not. So I agree with you. There was a great rabbi in England, Louis Jacobs, who said that many people would rather be certainly wrong than possibly right. And I think that's true.
Yeah, right to the point. Thank you.
There's one more question in the aside from accolades. There's one more question in the questions. Sadly, to me, it seems that faith is on the wane in the Western world. Do you have any comments on this trend and where it might be going?
Well, let me tell you, yes, it is on the wane. Although the salvation may come from these spiritual but not religious people. Because it turns out that if you want to be spiritual, you're going to want to hang out with other spiritual people and you're going to want to do things with your spirituality, which might involve life cycle moments. Maybe you want to be spiritual when you commit to another human person as your partner, when you have a child, when you retire, when you whatever. And that's going to turn into life cycle rituals. We have a word for that. It starts with R. So I think the fact that people are down on organized religion with its inflated certitude doesn't mean the end of religion with a small r. The shape of human spirituality has always been on the way, and it's always built on what came before it, and then it's boldly repackaged it. I don't think there's any sign of that stopping. I'll give you within the Jewish community, it's really interesting. The biggest change in the last 25 years of polling the Jewish community is that 25% now say no religion whatsoever. And if you ask those people, is your being Jewish important, very important, somewhat important, or not important? 85% say important or very important. Of that same group, the not religious ones, they're not practicing a religion, 80% have a Seder, a Passover dinner at Passover, right? What does that have to do with religion for a Jew? It's being Jewish. So I think there will be a way in which the religiousness, the spirituality of the future will shift. It won't look like the way it looked 40 years ago. But the human urge to make sense of things, the human intuition that we're part of something glorious and big and wonderful, and the urge to say thank you out to the universe, I don't think that's going away. And so long as that's there, we will keep coming up with ways to be spiritual and religious together.
Great, thank you. And with that, we're going to thank you, Rabbi Brad. This was a fabulous time. Your comments were really well appreciated. And as I said, there are accolades in the statements.